Greetings ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to my Total War Warhammer Wissenland lore video. In this video we'll look over some of the history and the nature of the people of Wissenland, and some of the things that are of particular note about the province itself. Originally, Wissenland, as we see the map of it here, wasn't encapsulating all of these territories. Originally, Wissenland had all the land from the Grey Mountains to the River Sol, which is the river you see in the middle here, and was split roughly along these lines. And that was the original province of Wissenland. Now, don't worry if you're slightly skewed by the perspective of this map. If you pay attention to the compass on the right, the map's been slightly turned and it's more sort of to the right. Although I will say that comparing this map to and other older maps of the Empire that Games Workshop put out, this map slightly differs from the one that Creative Assembly eventually used for Wissenland on their Empire maps. They made it more of an L shape, where really it sits more southernly in the Empire and is almost on a line with Karaz-a-Karak. If you imagine that's how far south it would go on the original maps. And Averland would have Blackfire Pass, but Blackfire Pass was more of a west to east pass than the north to south one we see in Total War Warhammer. But think of it this way, as this is maybe an older map, and much like older maps in the world we inhabit, the perspective can often be skewed and distances a little bit wrong from map to map due to the limitations of the technology at the time. So, here's the map of Wissenland, and on the left-hand side of the red line here, which is slightly roughly done outline of the Sol River, is the original province of Wissenland. And to the east, they used to have their neighbors, Soland. And Wissenland and Soland always had cordial relations. They were both really descendant from a people called the Merrigan, who were a tribe of people who existed at the time of Sigmar. And Sigmar called upon them to have the big showdown at Blackfire Pass with the Orc hordes, and they answered in droves and were a huge supporter of Sigmar and played a key part in the formation of the Empire as a whole. So, you might ask, what then happened to Soland? Well, Gorbad Ironclaw happened to Soland. He was an Orc war boss who led a huge war into the Empire in around the year 1700, around that time. In fact, I think it was by 1707 he'd managed to arrive in Soland and had ravaged the place entirely. His war actually made it all the way to Altdorf, where he didn't manage to breach the walls and was eventually sent back into, and eventually retreated back into the Badlands, whereupon he was set on by some dwarves from the Karaks. It's not actually known what his ultimate fate was. I might cover that in a separate Legendary Lord video, because I think he does still play an active role in the Warhammer world as we know it today. But suffice it to say, Gorbad came and ravaged Soland, completely destroyed it. There was a deciding battle called the Battle for the Crown of Soland, I think it was called, and Gorbad eventually killed the Elector Count of Soland, took his runefang, took his crown. After a while, he gave the runefang to some of the Orc shamans to try and make it more compatible with Orc magics and make it more useful to him. They could never really break the magics upon it, never really make it suit that Ironclaw, so he ended up throwing it away into a river, and it was eventually rediscovered by a peasant. And that's how it found its ways back into the hands of the Empire, and now I think is wielded by Kurt Helborg, who you may see mentioned in my Missing Legendary Lords video for the Empire, which I'll put a link to at the top of the page. Anyway, so Gorbad annihilates Soland, destroys all of its major settlements, and Soland never recovers. So, eventually Soland, which doesn't exist as a province anymore, is merged into Wissenland. The destruction of Soland is a horribly dark chapter in the Empire's history, and it's very much a mournful subject that people still to this day take very personally when it's brought up. The Wissenlanders very much, or Wissenlanders, however you like to pronounce it, very much respected their neighbors to the east. And as a sign of remembrance, if you look at the original sort of Warhammer flag, they have the lion holding the banner with the sun, and the sun represents the old sigil of Soland. Now, in Total War Warhammer, they've kind of done the same thing with the homage, but rather than the sun symbol, they decided to go for the twin-tailed comet, which isn't necessarily a tribute to Soland, more just a tribute to Sigmar, as that's his sign, the twin-tailed comet. I guess you could maybe argue that that was part of the Soland flag, so it is in honor, but the sigil on the flag that the lion holds in the Wissenland banner is meant to be in remembrance of the old province of Soland. So now, as a unified Wissenland, we have the province as we know it today. Now, the old capital of Soland used to be Fildorf, and Fildorf is still a major city in Wissenland as it stands today, and is one of the cities you indeed take over in Total War Warhammer. Now, although the two provinces have merged, they do have some slightly different ways in terms of their flora and fauna and the resources they had to deal with. So on the west, which is kind of the original Wissenland, it's very much in terms of like how they live and how they farm and things. The land there is very much sort of badly suited to farming. It's very rocky because it's at the sort of the feet of the Grey Mountains. So a lot of, the only farming they really do there is sort of subsistence farming, sort of just barely, they can grow barely enough to sort of keep each other going. But their main export and the main industry in that area is in fact mining. Now you might think, oh, but they're surrounded by dwarves and dwarves are the miners. But there have been treaties worked out over centuries where the dwarves have allowed the Wissenlanders, because they've been not very friendly with them throughout the centuries, the Wissenlanders to mine in certain areas. Now there is some illegal mining that goes on, and the dwarves are very quick to clamp down on any of this. Firstly, because yes, it's perceived as slightly stealing from their mountain holds and their mountain territories. And secondly, because they think that the humans do such a bloody piss poor job of mining in the first place. They actually take offense to some of the mines and the workmanship that goes into the mining that humans do, which just adds to their anger at illegal mining going on in their territories. Due to the approximation of the west part of Wissenland to the Grey Mountains, once spring comes in and the snows melt from the tops of the mountains, it can often cause a huge amount of flooding. One of the most famous occasions of this was in the year of the Imperial calendar 2484, where Meissen, as you see here, was almost completely destroyed in a huge flood. But just suffices to say that flooding is a constant threat and often happens on a sort of annual basis as the snows melt from the mountains and pour down through the rivers of Wissenland. Now, to the east, there's a slightly more different landscape. There are sort of lush rolling hills of grassland. It's great for farming. It's great for cultivating animals and livestock like sheep. They feed on the grasses. And indeed, they've actually become famed in the eastern part of Wissenland for the fine quality of their wool and indeed their furs. The fine wool, in fact, coming from all the grazing sheep in the rolling hills. And the fur industry is predominantly encircled around, now I'm going to mispronounce this, but Kroppenleben, which is down here in the southeast of the province. Near the Black Mountains and near the woods around there, that's where they sort of kill and get a lot of their furs that they trade. And indeed, Wissenland wool and furs are very much sought after in the markets of Altdorf for making fine dresses and fine outfits for the nobility of the area. Now, another factor of the landscape in the eastern part of Wissenland is that there are still ruins of the towns from the old province of Soland, of entire sort of abandoned ruined towns, of ruined castles, of ruined fortresses. Now, these are mostly avoided by the locals because, one, out of a sign of respect for the dead and the spirits that rest there, and secondly, because this is the Warhammer world, there's an actual severe likelihood that you will be attacked by ghosts if you visit these sites. So just bear that in mind. It adds a bit of a grim feature to the landscape of the eastern part of Wissenland, that there are these just ruined and on occasion haunted ruins of old Soland and all these old villages and fortifications that used to exist within the province. Trade also plays a significant part for Wissenland, just due to its position at the southern edge of the empire, the fact that it exposes itself to a number of passes that allow it access to both a number of dwarven carracks. There are passes in the mountains that get you to Bretonia, that get you to the Border Prince's territory, that get you to Tilia as well. These roads are sort of all accessed through mountain passes, and most of them tend to converge in Worcesterburg. And Worcesterburg becomes a bit of a trade hub within Wissenland, by road, because all these passes from all these different kingdoms tend to run through this town. It's an area of convergence. Wusterburg is also the area in which Bugman's Brewery used to be located. Now, Bugman's Brewery is where the legendary lord for the dwarves, Joseph Bugman, hails from, and this is where his father initially set up the family brewery. If you'd like to hear more of the story of Joseph Bugman, do click on the upper right. I'll put a link to the Missing Legendary Lords for the Dwarves video for you to check out, because his story's in there, and it's quite an interesting one, and he is a very famous character in the Warhammer world. Trade to Wusterburg is really facilitated by all of these mountain passes. Now, in winter, the winters are quite bitter in Wissenland, so in winter, a lot of these mountain passes are snowed over, which makes them inaccessible during winter months, but you still want to keep trade going. And they do have access to the sea in the northern part of their province through the rivers and things, and it takes a while to get there. But they also have access to something called the River of Echoes. And that is an underground river that starts near Kurzhofen in the south of the province, the very southern tip of the province. And that underground river runs from Kurzhofen all the way to Miragliano, which is, as you may know, the capital of Tilia, and that's on the coast, and that allows access to the sea. Now, this is an invaluable trading source in the winter months. It allows Wissenland to still have access to the sea in the southern part of its border and continue trade with Tilia year-round. Now, essentially, what the River of Echoes has carved out underneath the mountains is a 150-mile-long tunnel that connects the two nations. And this tunnel, due to treaties, is actually policed by the Tilians. They're the ones who have sort of troops and are responsible for the security of it. But Wissenland's kind of happy to let them have that because the trade it provides year-round is invaluable to the province. Now, I think this River of Echoes could provide a very interesting underground feature when I think Skaven will be introduced, because there's the Under Empire, and I think they will have to introduce some kind of subterranean map, or at least subterranean features to Total War Warhammer with the introduction of the Skaven. So this might be a landscape feature for the Under Empire. So looking forward to that edition, hopefully in the future of Total War Warhammer. Now, in terms of the people themselves, the people of Wissenland are a very hardy and dour people. They put up with these bitter winters. They speak in Reichsspiel, as does the rest of the Empire, but they deliver it in a very monotone and in a way that the rest of the sort of Empire provinces find kind of demure and depressing. Some say that they've been hanging around the dwarves for too long, which has made their method of speech very short and to the point, very sort of practical approach to language. None of this sort of flouty nature. Indeed, this transfers over to their appreciation of the arts as well. The Wissenlanders don't like to waste time with artists and poems and things they find like the foppish habits of their Reichlander neighbors. They don't have any time for that. It's about being hard people in a relatively hard land, and that's what Wissenlanders are all about. Although it has been said they have known to soften after a couple of maybe dwarven ales in them, and they might launch into a song, maybe a rendition of something like The Lament of Soland, which is a lonesome ballad, or something equally as depressing. So no songs of joy, really. Just if they do, I don't know, take the stick out of their arse for a moment, it's only to sing you a depressing song. So there we go. That's the sort of attitude of Wissenlanders in general. In terms of their religious devotions, the Wissenlanders do very much worship Sigmar, and Sigmar worship tends to be concentrated in terms of the temples and the shrines to Sigmar on the west of the country. Indeed, there's a very famous church or chapel to Sigmar located in the Grey Mountains and said to be upriver from Getchberg. Now, Getchberg's here, so I'm not really sure what the descriptions mean by upriver, but I'm guessing that means anywhere in this sort of general area, because in the 14th century, the Elector Count of Wissenland at the time was fighting an orc horde, and he was surrounded. And it was said a warrior appeared to him and his troops, armed with a hammer, and claimed to be Sigmar himself, and fought with them, and took down a huge number of orcs, and then promptly disappeared. And this prompted the Elector Count at the time to build a chapel to Sigmar, as he believed that Sigmar had in fact appeared to him in the flesh and saved them from the inevitable fate of death by the orc. So there's a sighting of Sigmar apparently many centuries ago that happened in these Grey Mountains, and there's a chapel to him built in one of these areas. Now the other gods more worshipped in the east of the nation are Tal and Rhea. Tal is the god of nature, very much an equivalent to something like Isha for the elves. So the god of nature, god of the woods, god of beasts. And Rhea is the goddess of fertility, of farming, of the earth, things like that. So these two gods are sort of the other highlighted gods and most popularly worshipped within Wissenland. And their shrines and things tend to be concentrated in the eastern part of that province. Now, just a couple of things to point out about the province. In Total War Warhammer, the capital of Wissenland is in fact described as Nuln. But that's not the case. The capital of Wissenland is Wissenburg, which is just slightly to the southeast of Nuln, and it does appear in Total War Warhammer, but it appears much further away than I think it is in the old maps and in the old world, the way Game Workshop laid it out. Now, the reason that Wissenburg is the capital is because Nuln is to some degrees an independent city-state. It is officially still considered part of Wissenland, but runs itself and is slightly isolated from, I think, maybe the laws and the running of Wissenland as a whole. We'll get more into that when we look at the Countess of Wissenland as she stands at the moment. But suffice to say that Nuln is almost a independent city, but it's still officially part of Wissenland, but not the capital. Now, Nuln itself is a fantastic city. It is one of the, if not the most cultural city in the entirety of the Empire. The fact that it's located on the River Reich and is at the fork where that splits to the River Ava, and the fact that it's located almost on the borders of 4 Empire provinces, being Reichland, Wissenland, Stirland, and Averland. And that makes it a center for trade and hub and the blending of cultures, and a huge mixing of the peoples of the Empire. It's also a huge educational center. It has probably arguably the best universities within the Empire located within it. Second, maybe in a very close competition with Altdorf itself. Amongst these fine universities are the Barrister College, the Elementalist College, there's colleges of magic located within the city. There's even a halfling university within the walls of Nuln itself. It also has a Temple of Sigmar located here in the city, which is a huge site for pilgrimage, and that is because of Nuln's very close ties to an old emperor of the Empire called Magnus the Pious. Now, Magnus the Pious was a minor Wissenland noble who was living in Nuln at the time, and this was during the Great War of Chaos. And Chaos had started to amass a horde unlike any seen in living memory, and they had already started to march on Kislev. And the Empire at the time was split. It didn't have a singular emperor. At the time, it was really a divided power. And in the city of Nuln, a chaos cult had emerged of Zinich. And this chaos cult acted on Nuln and tried to take it over. This minor noble, Magnus, united the people of Nuln and got them to fight back the cult of chaos that had emerged within the city. He then went on to unite the Empire again behind him to march on the chaos horde that was amassing and wreaking havoc in Kislev. Unfortunately, they hadn't made it in time enough to save the city of Prague, but had made it in time, and they did amass the biggest Empire army ever put together. They managed to fight back the tides of chaos. And he was very devout to the worship of Sigmar, and had the temple built in Nuln, and he actually ran the country out of Nuln, which has, at times, on and off throughout the history of the Empire, been the capital of the entirety of the Empire, not even just of Wissenland. So many religious devotees flock there to sort of praise the memory of Magnus the Pious, and just to see the sights, be where he stood, and things like that. As well as the temple to Sigmar, it's also one of the places where one of the two arch-lectors of the Empire is stationed. So those two lieutenants of Volkmar the Grim, the Grand Theogonist, the two men equally under him as the heads of the Church of Sigmar, one of them is based in Nuln. And the other building of great import within Nuln itself is, of course, the Imperial Gunnery School. Now, the Imperial Gunnery School is responsible for the mass production of black powder weapons within the Empire, as well as the training of the crews on the firing and maintenance of those weapons. The school has the highest standards of any artillery school within the Empire, of any of the workshops within the Empire. As a result, their crews are in very high demand. At times, they have been asked to maybe lower their standards slightly, just so they can produce more crews for the Empire's war machine. And they have always staunchly resisted, stating they wouldn't want to train a mob of substandard graduates to be using the weapons of the Empire. So they have exalted standards that they hold themselves to and refuse to budge on. There are, in fact, a number of dwarves who work in the Imperial Gunnery School, just to speak to the quality of some of the weapons they produce. They're known as the best weapons in the old world, with the exception of maybe the dwarves' artillery. In terms of the people who make up the artillery crews, the crews themselves are often made up of the members of the local militia who are then taken in and trained, but the officers who are in charge of commanding and setting the artillery pieces and taking into account all the calculations that need to be done when targeting the enemy, that is all done by the officers, and the officers are recruited from amongst the noble families in Nuln and even further afield. This is because officer training is a hugely expensive endeavor, and it's a very sought-after profession, as it were. It's very well respected within the Empire to be a gunnery officer. So, the sons of the nobles tend to make up the officers, and their training involves obviously rigorous amounts of classroom learning in terms of learning the mathematics of ballistics, but also they need to go out and do some field testing. Now, the period from sort of arrival at school to graduation isn't set. It's sort of unique until you're found that your work is of the appropriate standard, and then they decide that you can graduate. But part of that is going through the field testing period, whereby you have to take a weapon of your own design out into the field and test it in combat. And you're assessed by someone who accompanies you, which will either be a senior gunnery officer or indeed a master engineer. And this is the same for no matter what you're doing. If you're looking to be a gunner, or if you're looking to crew any of the artillery pieces within the Empire, they all have to go through this field training course. And over the process of this training, you're essentially allowed to pick where you go, but you have to be in combat, so you're going to want to go with sort of any traveling army, or maybe just go to a particularly dangerous part of the Empire. And you can take whatever you want. So if you invented a new kind of steam tank, you can take that, but you'd be solely responsible for the cost of the manufacture, the transport, and looking after every aspect, and that would be prohibitively expensive for an individual student. Usually the family's covering the bill, but still there are limits. So more often than not, it's probably a hand weapon that the pupils take with them into the field. And the master engineer or the senior gunnery officer assesses both the weapon and the performance of the officers themselves. And if they're found to be of adequate standard, they can either choose to remain at the school and go on to be trained in more complex artillery pieces like cannon or the mortars or what have you, or even the steam tank, or they can just choose to join the ranks of the pistoliers or the outriders. And that's essentially the first step of their educational process. So that takes them to graduation from the school. They can continue their education to master more complex machines, or they can stay on the hand weapons and become pistoliers or outriders. So that about sums it up for the gunnery school. One of the most prestigious parts of the Empire and a very well respected profession. They do, however, not design the weapons themselves. This is done at the College of Engineers. There is a College of Engineers in Nuln, but I think the more prestigious one is in fact located in Altdorf. And the engineers send over blueprints, and it's up to the Imperial Gunnery School to make them function. And the Imperial Gunnery School is really built around Nuln and what Nuln is. And Nuln, with its sort of ore processing foundries, its workshops, is really an entire city geared towards the manufacture of war machines for the Imperial effort. It's a city with culture and theater and poetry and beauty, but also it's probably the most industrially heavy city in the Empire. And it is sort of the workhorse of the Empire as far as the production of cannon, as far as the production of any of its war weapons or machines of war. So a very important city to the Empire and key to the Empire's defense. So moving on from the Imperial Gunnery School, let's have a look at some of the important figures around the Empire. And let's start with the Countess Emmanuelle von Leibowitz. She holds the titles of the Countess of Wissenland, the Countess of Nuln, and the Duchess of Meissen, which is another city located within Wissenland. Now, she rose to the seat of the Elector Count just after Karl Franz had become emperor, so really at the beginning of the time period in Total War Warhammer. Her and Karl Franz are said to have been childhood friends, and she had a very weak claim to the Elector Count seat. She didn't inherit it from her father, I don't believe. I think it was a distant relative, and there were people with stronger claims. But with the backing of Karl Franz, which she managed to secure, she managed to rise and take the seat of Elector Count. Now, this raised a lot of eyebrows within the Empire. People weren't sure why Karl Franz had backed her, and rumors of her seducing him began to circulate throughout the Empire. She was said, of course, to be a very pretty woman, and I think in current tales she's approaching middle-aged, but has said to have kept much of her youthful beauty, although you would not have guessed that from some of the models that some people have put together. As it turned out, after she became Elector Count, she had no head for governing. She was kind of terrible at managing a province, and as Nuln was slightly independent, she held joint titles, so she is the Countess of Wissenland and the Countess of Nuln, but theoretically, those two things could be run by different people, although Nuln at this point does not have a vote in the Elector Count Council, so that's only, she gets that only as the Countess of Wissenland. It's quite complex. I'm not 100% sure on it myself, the relationship between Nuln and Wissenland, and the nature of which it's independent from Wissenland itself. Let's go through the Countess story, and she sheds a little bit of light on it. So, having no head for managing the province, she's really just always been obsessed with the luxury that her status and her power affords her. She likes the silks, she likes the theatre of Nuln, she likes the pomp and ceremony of the city, but she really doesn't like the rest of the province. She doesn't like Wissenland. She thinks it's full of yokels, and she considers it slightly a backwater province itself, although she loves Nuln. So she has a disdain for the common people of Wissenland. She thinks they're kind of backcountry yokels, and she doesn't really care about managing it. She tends to leave the managing of Wissenland to a family called the Toppenheimers. I believe that's who they are. The Toppenheimers, who are based out of Waldorf. And they tend to manage the day-to-day goings-on with a council of merchants and other important figures within Wissenland. They tend to manage the day-to-day goings-on of the province. And even within the city, there's another council within Nuln who tend to manage the goings-on within Nuln. She has kind of little to do with it and rarely turns up to these council meetings. But despite this, and despite her kind of luxurious living, she is very much loved by the common people. They think she's very beautiful and very charming, and they very much have taken her to their hearts as the lady of their province. Because she doesn't like the rest of the province, she has very much pushed for further independence for Nuln. She wants it to be officially severed from Wissenland, be a completely independent city-state, and give her an elector vote, as well as leaving the management of Wissenland with an elector vote as well. So elector votes are very important in things like even picking the future empire. So each elector count of each province has an elector vote. Now, what she's arguing is, listen, Karl, you give me Nuln, I'll keep it, I'll run that, I'll give up Wissenland, you give Wissenland a vote, and you give me a vote as the independent city of Nuln, and we'll take things from there, and for that, I will give you a vast sum of money. So she's trying to do something that's not dissimilar to what Marienburg did about, I think it's 80 years ago, 80 years from the beginning of Total War Warhammer. The emperor who let Marienburg do that was very much put down upon, because he let them become independent. He let them become independent of the empire. I don't think she's suggesting independence from the Empire. She's just suggesting independence from Nuln itself. And she is trying to get this done by offering a vast sum of money to Karl Franz to the Emperor's coffers. A loan that sort of doesn't need to be repaid as such. A bribe, effectively. And the idea is that Karl Franz, in the Total War Warhammer story, the only reason he's even considering this is because he needs to spend a lot of money rebuilding the fortifications of the north to guard against chaos, I believe is his justification for considering this at the time. But that's kind of where things lie. She's pushing for this further independence of Nuln away from Wissenland, as she has a slight disdain for the rest of the province, and the Emperor's considering it, and things are kind of in a state of negotiation, but nothing has as of yet been decided, I think, in the current tabletop timeline at the very least. People have noticed that she is kind of terrible at running Wissenland. And there is a common phrase that goes on about the Countess that might give you an idea of how she's seen it amongst the nobles, not amongst the common people. And they often say, her head is as empty as her manifesto. So she's very much recognized as kind of a vapid lady, unliked within the ruling classes of Wissenland and of Nuln. As I said, she is still considered an attractive woman and does have many suitors, although has never married, and because she's over 30 and in the Warhammer world that's considered a spinster, she's regarded as the most eligible spinster within the Empire. So there you go. There are a couple of other characters who have made their names within Wissenland as some folk who, if Wissenland's ever expanded out to a independent faction, we may indeed see. And those are Theodore Bruckner, I believe his name is. And Theodore is the judicial champion and the headsman for the Countess Emmanuelle von Leibowitz. And he's very similar to another legendary lord within the Empire called Ludwig Schwarzhelm. He plays, and Ludwig is very much sort of the man who carries out justice on behalf of the Emperor, but he's kind of the Countess's version of that. So if someone wants to undertake a trial by combat and challenges the state, or challenges the Countess as the judge in the ceremonies, then it is Theodore who will fight her battle for her. And he's said to be not the most skilled swordsman or the quickest, but he's said to be huge and have enormous physical strength. Whether this comes from suspected Norse blood in his lineage, which is kind of frowned upon but is a possibility, or the fact that there's been some kind of alchemical experiment done on him when he was a younger boy, no one's quite sure. But he possesses huge amounts of strength and is a very large man. It's said that during a trial by combat, in fact, he is not the quickest, and so a very skilled duelist had managed to disarm him. But instead of trying to retrieve his sword, he simply grabbed his opponent and bear-hugged him so hard he managed to snap his opponent's spine. In terms of his armaments, he's armed with a magic sword called Liar's Bane, and he also has a magic lance known as the Storm Lance. It's said to have been blessed by wizards of the Law of Heavens, and when it strikes the opponent, it's like they're being struck by lightning, and they set aflame and explode as well. His mount, as you can see here, is a demigryph known by the name of Reaper. It's argued that Reaper might in fact be the largest demigryph in the known world. It suits its rider because it matches his equally large stature. So between the two of them, they make a very formidable pair on the battlefield, and very much look to enforce the will of the Countess herself. Another character to look out for in Wissenland is Jubal Falk. Now, Jubal Falk is an extremely talented graduate of the Imperial Gunnery College. In fact, he's so good, he's often talked about as an eventual successor as the Grand Master of the Guild of the college. So eventually he might end up running the entire thing. At the moment, however, he serves with a well-renowned unit of gunners called the Ironsiders, which are essentially a heavily armored unit of handgunners. He's said to be an iron disciplinarian, and he likes to sport, in terms of his facial hair, a mustache with mutton chops. And if you can pull it off, I say by all means, go for it. He's armed himself with a pistol and the famed Hochland rifle, which are essentially the Warhammer equivalent of sniper rifles. And he's built himself a special kind of ammunition with his rifle that he fills, it's a hollow bullet that he fills with an alchemical substance that tends to strike down corrupted monsters very easily. It's not really gone into what the substance is. Suffice it to say it's magical in nature and has a very harmful effect against corrupted monsters. So he would act as an engineer, but I don't see us seeing him in Total War Warhammer until they introduce engineers for the Empire, which they haven't done as of the recording of this video. And those are kind of the most important characters that we may see pop up in the Total War Warhammer game. It'd be nice to see the Countess, although admittedly she would not be the first one to lead troops into battle, so I don't believe she's ever been given any official rules on the tabletop. Do let me know in the comments if I'm wrong on that. I'd be curious about it myself. But I think these other two champions of hers might be interesting figures to see at some point in the future of Total War Warhammer. Now, in terms of the armies of Wissenland itself, it's quite paradoxical the kind of troops that make up the armies of Wissenland. Wissenland itself is, although the Nuln has huge riches and is paid vast sums of money for its wealth of knowledge and its ability to build artillery weapons, that tends not to be spread out amongst the province as a whole. And as such, the army of the province is relatively underfunded, whereas the troops based in Nuln might be quite well equipped with artillery and gun units. The rest of Wissenland's army tends to consist mainly of mounted bowmen and woodsmen. So these guys tend to use hit-and-run tactics to fight off any enemies they have, and they just tend to use sort of archer fire and things like that, which is very paradoxical to the nature of Wissenland as a whole, which essentially serves the purpose of being the manufacturing workshop of all of the Empire's black powder weapons. So it's very strange that their army mainly consists of bowmen and riders. So it's a bit paradoxical, but there you go. Those are what consist of the armies of Wissenland. And it'll be interesting to see whether Creative Assembly stick to that, or they just say, this doesn't make any sense, let's change it and make the armies of Wissenland all black powder all the time, as that's what the province is known for. But Wissenland is a very interesting province. I think some notable features being that River of Echoes, that underwater river, which might have some particular implications for future under-Empire stuff, and the fact that Nuln, being the jewel it is with all its magical use of black powder and manufacture of fantastic weapons for the Empire. But I hope you guys enjoyed that. I'll pop up some other videos, including my Marienburg lore video. I may make some further province videos and see how we get along, if I can find another province of interest, maybe Middenland next, to cover what looks like now the inevitable release of Middenland becoming its own independent faction. But hope you enjoyed this, and please do join me on the next one, and subscribe to do so. Thanks very much, guys.